Hello, welcome to the Center for Geopolitics seminar on China and India and the recent face-off in the Himalayan region of Ladakh. We are joined today by a stellar panel to discuss this. With me is Manish Tiwari, Member of Parliament of the Indian Lower House, and also a Senior Fellow of the Atlantic Council, Dr. Aparna Pandey, who directs the South Asia Initiative at the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C., Professor Jonathan Holzlag, who will join us from the Free University of Brussels and an Asia expert and international politics expert. And last but not least, Dr. Sameer Saran, who is the president of South Asia's most influential foreign policy think tank, the Observer Research Foundation. So I am Shruti Kapela. I teach history and politics of India at the University of Cambridge, and it is a total delight to have a large number of you who have signed on to this web discussion, and it's a testament to this very stellar panel. So let me just be very brief in my opening comments, just to say that about 6 weeks ago, at the end of April, there were hostilities that were reported in Ladakh, which is on the kind of northern end of the Chinese-Indian border. This is a very large border, close to 4,000 kilometers. And it's the first such fracas on this end of the border, having seen such minor border disputes on the eastern side of the Himalayas. The trigger points could be many, and some of our panelists will speak to it, but one of them could be not just the global pandemic and China's reputation that is taking a beating, but also the fact that India delinked the administration of Ladakh from the disputed province, the internal province of course, India, Kashmir, but the disputed territory of Kashmir. So where does this leave the India-Chinese relationship? And to look at two other things. One, India's extreme dependence on Chinese goods, that the economic, as it were, demands versus strategic imperatives. India's move towards much more an open embrace with America, as well as is a real question that China is really India's #1 antagonist, rather than, as it were, Pakistan, on which in a way always features, particularly in Indian nationalist rhetoric in India. So without further ado, the idea is that we will have 5 minutes of opening comments, starting with Manish Tiwari and ending with Sameer Saran, and then there'll be a moderated conversation, and we'll take questions from the audience, and we hope to close this within an hour or so. And this is available, will be available on our website once it's done. So Manish, thank you so much for joining us all the way from your constituency in Punjab and your very busy schedule. So could I please ask you to say something on what has happened and put it in context, and why now?
Well, thank you, Shruti, and thank you, Center for Geopolitics, for putting this event together. Things between India and China are tense. That obviously would constitute the understatement of the year. But be that as it may, I think it's extremely important to try and understand as to why China has decided to up the ante at this point in time. See, China has land boundary disputes with 23 of its neighbors. It's sorted its disputes with 17 of them. In fact, I guess except for India and by extension Bhutan, China really has no land boundary disputes left. All its disputes are maritime as we speak. And so therefore it begs the obvious question, when the Chinese have given an arm and a leg in many cases to settle those land boundary disputes, why do they continue on insisting that even the line of actual control be not demarcated on mutually agreed maps? And I guess the contest between India and China is a larger civilizational contest from the Chinese point of view. Otherwise, there is no reason as to why a dispute, which is really territorial in nature, which talks about delineating and defining boundaries could not really have been settled despite 23 rounds of special representative talks between 1988 and 2020. Till about 1993, they were called by another nomenclature. Subsequently, the nomenclature changed, and then in 2006, it became talks between the special representatives. And my sense is that what is happening on the Sino-Indian border has a larger context. China obviously is not too pleased with the global headlines post COVID-19, which holds the Chinese either for a war-driven incident, which has resulted in this pandemic, or at the least not being completely transparent with the world when it came to reporting on the origin of the pandemic, maybe much earlier than finally when they came to the WHO on the 31st of December 2020. Be that as it may, the COVID-19 pandemic has caused loss of lives and livelihoods across the world. At one point in time, maybe 4 to 5 billion people on planet Earth were in some kind of a lockdown. And if you happen to be an emerging great power, and if you have illusions about yourself, this is not the kind of reputation you would really like to have. And so therefore, the Chinese very deliberately have created points to really take COVID-19 headlines off the global media. So they moved in the South China Sea with the announcement of these two new administrative districts, which obviously has been contested by the littoral states and the United States of America, forcing the US to possibly launch its fifth freedom of navigation mission in the last 6 months. It has moved on Hong Kong, whereby it has put a new draft security law on the table. And then it has decided to move on the Indian border, knowing fully well that when two nuclear armed neighbors face off, especially at a tri-junction when the third party also happens to possess nuclear weapons, it is going to grab headlines, and around the world it is going to cause concern. And so therefore this seems to be a deliberate attempt by the Chinese in order to distract responsibility or to deflect from its primary responsibility with regard to accountability on COVID-19, which has been demanded by not only the United States of America, but by Australia and many other countries around the world. Another dimension of what is happening on the border also has something to do with India becoming the chair of the World Health Organization, and the observer status of Taiwan being up for restoration insofar as the World Health Organization is concerned. So it seems to be a calibrated attempt to put pressure on India. And what we've seen in the death of 20 of our soldiers and many more injured, and possibly the most brutal hand-to-hand fight that the Sino-Indian border has seen since 1947, really does not have a rationale. For if you go by the dispute or by Chinese concerns with regard to infrastructure that India may be constructing on its side, well, those concerns have been there for a long time. There is no immediate flashpoint insofar as those particular concerns are, manifest themselves. To your question, Shruti, and I'll end with that it has something to do with India changing the status quo with regard to Jammu and Kashmir. Well, that's entirely something which is internal to India. It does not really impact the extraterritorial boundaries or the territorial boundaries of India. And in fact, if you rewind back to 1947, Pakistan has changed the internal status of Pak-occupied Kashmir and the northern areas, many times over. There is no time, otherwise I could have gone into some detail with regard to how the constitutional arrangements have been changed. So to conclude, I think this is a part of a larger design by China to detract, deflect, and possibly obfuscate the responsibility that it needs to take for spreading the COVID-19 pandemic across the world.
Thank you very much, Manish. Dr. Aparna Pandey from DC.
Good morning, or good morning my time, and thanks to Dr. Kapila and the Center for Geopolitics for inviting me to speak today. Actually good to see some old friends, even if virtually. I'll make a few points and then happy to discuss further later. The ongoing India-China border standoff is not the first, and it will not be the last in the next coming years. There have been 4 border standoffs since 2012, and 2 in the space of the last 3 years, all of which show that instead of actually seeking a border dispute resolution, China is trying to change the ground reality to its advantage. The underlying factor, I believe, is the steady rise of the revisionist state, China. China has never accepted the borders it inherited. It has consistently sought to change the ground reality, whether on land, along the Himalayan borders, or in the sea, in the South China Sea. One of the problems we faced is the so-called peaceful rise of China has also upended one of the long-held notions that if a country integrates globally, then economic and political and diplomatic bonds will curb any aggressive instincts and also help resolve bilateral disputes. So for a long period of time, India believed that if it built economic ties with China, it would be, and put the border dispute on the back burner, it would actually be able to resolve these issues because China would not have an incentive for conflict. And over a period of time, the fact that China is one of India's top trading partners would ensure that the Indian market would be more important for the Chinese state than the border conflict. China, however, has used the last few decades to boost its economic and its military potential. It's also boosted its infrastructure on its side of the line of actual control. India is still playing catch up. India's economy has actually slowed down in the last few years. And rhetoric aside, its military modernization is decades behind what it should be. We are trying to boost the infrastructure on our side of the line of actual control, but it will take some time. It is not going to happen overnight. Beijing has also mastered the ability of building strategic relations with the immediate neighbors of its competitors. In the case of India, almost all of India's South Asian neighbors, especially Pakistan, Nepal, and sort of, I'll not say Sri Lanka because Sri Lanka doesn't tie into the land border, but Nepal and Pakistan. Turning to Pakistan, from the 1950s, China actually supported Pakistan's aspirations. It has helped it economically, militarily, nuclear. And in the Kashmir dispute, which is primarily between India and Pakistan, China has supported the Pakistani point of view on international fora whenever there's any India-Pakistan dispute. And China has used its occupation of Indian territory in Ladakh, Aksai Chin namely, to arrogate to itself the right to be a participant in this dispute. And therefore, any time India does anything within Kashmir, China claims that it impinges on Chinese sovereignty or Chinese integrity, or it affects Tibet or Xinjiang. Currently, we also see that India is facing not only the traditional problems it faces on the India-Pakistan border, which means Indian troops have to be on that border, but there's a dispute with Nepal at the same time that China has actually sent in troops into Ladakh. China moves in sort of multiple or simultaneous moves, so I don't believe it is sort of just fortuitous that Nepal's map has been released, or that India-Nepal tensions and India-Pakistan tensions are on a rise at the same time that India-China tensions. This keeps Delhi sort of having to focus on multiple arenas at the same time. I will sort of, stop there, but before I end, I will say that the last few standoffs, especially 2017 in Doklam, should teach India, should teach us to be wary of China's 2 steps forward and 1 step backward strategy. What ends up happening in Doklam was that even though China did move back, China has retained control and kept its infrastructure. That should not happen in the case of Galwan Valley and Ladakh, when China does disengage and move back. If China retains control of some part of the territory, it will have walked away with more territory than it had to begin with. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Jonathan Halslag, welcome to the panel, and it's your turn to sort of open up with some comments. Oh, you're muted. You need to turn.
Okay, second try.
Yes, that's it. Yes.
So thanks again for the invitation, and it's good to see a lot of friends around. The question asked was, what is happening between China and India? That is, of course, a very broad question, and I think the recent border incidents have taken us all a bit aback in trying to answer it. In making that attempt, I would like to steer clear of trying to speculate what the explanations are of what happened in the last few. Too early to assess that precisely, but rather to paint a broader canvas of what is going on between these two Asian giants. And I would like to summarize that a bit in a Chinese way into 1 constant and 3 changes. I think the constant echoes what Manish just said, that is persistent confusion over the border, despite decades of dialogues. And we could all see this coming, that the various dialogues and discussions set up between Delhi and China would not really lead to meaningful settlement on that border dispute, and that also attempts towards this deconfliction were sort of partial at best. I don't think that this situation will go away, and that this first factor will remain here and will continue to cause instability and tension in the years, if not decades, to come. There are some important changes, however, and I think a first very important change is the diminishing of the stopping power of the Himalayas. The Himalaya is less and less a barrier. It counts more and more soldiers, and that also means more and more incidents, inevitably. And I don't have much indications that the one or the other side has suddenly become more forward-leaning. I think both India and China are trying to step up their presence. But that leads me to a second important change, that in regard to that attempt to grow their presence and their military capability in the border issue, in the border area, China is clearly winning. And this is also what Aparna just said. If we just zoom into the border area, I think it's quite obvious that China is far, far better equipped. China annually constructs over 180 kilometers of border roads, some of them hardened, and that's much more than India. We see the Indian Border Road Organization still several years behind of what it had targeted in terms of roads to be completed. We see also that China is much quicker in equipping airstrips and airports on the Tibetan Plateau with helicopters and also with drones and fighter jets equipped for high altitude warfighting. I think that also is an important indication. We see that China's sensing capacity, for instance, by means of radars and so forth in the Himalaya is also far more advanced. I think it's a matter of China's presence on the disputed border, but also a little bit further away. If we consider a more extended border area, we see that China's Western Theater Command in the last 10 years has made huge progress. For example, if India still struggle to properly equip the 17 Mountain Strike Corps to also make sure that these soldiers have proper training and exercises, a series of large-scale, high-altitude exercises by the Western Military District, Chinese Western Military District, I think show that China is continuing to outpace its southern neighbor. And then, of course, if we continue to broaden the context, if you look at China's growing presence into the Indian Ocean region, for instance, I think, and I'm exaggerating now a bit, but economically it's being turned more into a Chinese lake than into an Indian maritime sphere of influence. And we can get into many different details, ranging from the presence of Chinese fisheries ships over deep sea mining and Chinese presence in various ports. I think other layers that need to be considered, but I will not dwell on them too lengthily for this introduction, is strategic deterrence, of course, and also the balance of power between China and India in terms of cyber and space dominance. I think here just China has left India behind, and it's going to be very difficult for India in the near future to catch up. Another third important change, I think, is of economic nature and will complicate Indian efforts to catch up with China, and also to provide in domestic stability through the traditional kind of strategy of urbanization combined with industrialization. What we see globally is that economic growth has become much more capital intensive, so that it will all in all become harder for India to become, so to say, a second China, to have a rapid industrialization that creates labor intensive growth, and that on its turn can serve as a source of political legitimacy for whoever is in the government. Coming to the conclusion, I think all in all, what characterizes China's posturing is somewhat understandable and predictable. China is growing stronger and hence also flexes its muscle more, is acting much more assertively on the Sino-Indian border and elsewhere. What I think is a bit more troubling on the other side is that India still doesn't really seem to know its place in the changing world order. I think it's quite clear to all of us that India has the potential of becoming a very important regional power, if not a major power, that it has a very long history as a civilization, also as a political player in the world, and that this, of course, has led India to pursue a policy of non-alignment. But I think that this is no longer tenable today. India has an economy that is at this point smaller than that of France. And a policy of non-alignment that often also coincides with a rather confrontational attitude towards countries like the United States, but that comes from two ways nowadays. Japan, you can also say, also rather a stubborn attitude towards the European Union in terms of trade and investment. I think that is very to reconcile with the fact that India is losing out so fast. So I would advise, and I would think that is going to be critical for the coming years, that India will really have to search itself a place that is closer with key partners. And I would say that it would be India's best pick to work closer with the United States, with Europe, to explore deeper and more meaningful security cooperation, and also to show a little bit more flexibility in trying to strengthen trade relations, because I think otherwise investors will continue to prefer China above India. So that would be my very concise overview, and I look forward to discussing some of the elements more into detail later on.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. I hadn't heard the word non-alignment in some time, so that was a bit of a blast from the past. So on to Samir Saran to give us his opening comment. A lot has already been covered, so I look for, yeah, on to you.
It's kind of difficult to be the last speaker when you have four very fine minds and lay out the landscape. And in that sense, I'm going to struggle to add anything new. But let me just first mention to Jonathan that non-alignment is no longer an Indian reality. It is a European urge. I think it is Europe which is seeking non-alignment now. And they need to be more worried about their relationships in the future, even as we realize the follies of our past. So I guess there is some convergence, and perhaps we need to have a separate conversation, and we might be able to advise you on some of your own musings in the geography you sit in. Having said that, let me just, in a sense, pick up something that Mr. Tiwari mentioned, the Chinese urge. And I think there are three Chinese urges that need to be deciphered. The first, of course, is I think China is conducting, and my book, Pax Sinica, delves into this. It delves into the systems and networks and power arrangements that China is building, be it the capture of New York Times and Washington Post and universities in UK, EU, and US, be it the use of industry and businesses to lobby for its cause, be it the investments into the third sector, the civil society organizations and NGOs. It is clearly putting together a very large global arrangement where it wants to be one of the most important, if not the sole arbiter of the global future. And in that global future, it sees itself willing to share power with a few other actors. Could be the US for some time, could be the EU for some time as well, but especially when it comes to economic activities. But certainly it sees no role for any other actor in Asia. It is willing to look at a multipolar world. It is not willing to look at a multipolar Asia. It wants to hardwire its immediate neighborhood in its own image. Socialism with Chinese characteristics is the destiny of all of us, unless India gets its act together and is able to provide something which is effective and different. So that's the first urge. Pax Sinica is the big, large Chinese project. It sensed the moment in 2009 when it started dilly-dallying on its border conversations with India, because it realized the asymmetry between India and China had grown. US was no longer, the Pax Americana moment was over with the financial crisis. Organizations like BRICS, etc., were vehicles for Chinese ascendance. And thereafter, by 2013, its tone had completely changed. Towards the end of Mr. Tiwari's government in New Delhi, you could see those changes begin to happen. It was Detsam, if I remember, in 2013 when you were the minister, sir. And then, of course, 2017 Doklam, and now we have the Galwan Valley clash. So I think the first is Pax Sinica and how India responds to the big Chinese hardwiring that is underway. The second is more immediate. I think China is also, in some sense, in a crude manner, in a more opaque manner, conducting its own Monroe Doctrine. Mm-hmm. It wants to be quite sure and certain that there is no other external influence more important than China in the entire neighborhood. Mm-hmm. It wants to ensure that no other country in Asia, be it the ASEAN grouping, be it the South Asian grouping, be it the Central Asian grouping, be it even the East Asian countries, none of them see any other actor more important than China in their foreign policy outlook. China wants to be the sole arbiter in the neighborhood, and India is a thorn in that process. It is the last man standing. You would recall that when China changed facts on the ocean in South China Sea, when it changed the geography of South China Sea, US, Europe, and the Southeast Asian countries could do nothing but allow that to unfold. India took a stand in Doklam, whether it was sustainable, whether it was sustained, whether it is likely to be repeated is something that will have to be seen in the days ahead. But clearly, India is under tremendous pressure by a unrelenting, land-hungry, medieval Middle Kingdom that wants to change geography to suit its purpose. Let there be no doubt. And neither the Americans nor the great Western Pacific Alliance could prevent China from changing the geography of the Western Pacific. And therefore, you can understand the difficulty India faces today as it tries to retain the geography of the Himalayas. And I think that's the second big trend that is underway. The third and more important trend is what we haven't discussed, but which is equally important, is China's complete conviction that the next 60 years are for its prowess and economy to dominate global systems. They are largely going to be digital and technology oriented. If America ruled the second and third industrial revolution, the Pax Britannica ruled the first, the Chinese are going to rule the fourth industrial revolution. So digital platforms, digital economy, digital investments into India and all other countries around it are extremely crucial to China's larger term goals, longer term goals, bigger goals. And there again, it sees in India potentially one of the largest markets it could capture by a little bit of political jostling, or it could lose if it was not handled properly, because India could be the swing state that could keep the digital economy more tethered to the Atlantic system than to China's own models. And there again, you are beginning to see a digital Cold War or digital confrontation unfold. Now, this is not purely an Indian reality. Everything that I've mentioned, changing geography, a digital confrontation, and Pax Sinica impacts UK, EU, US, and everyone else. I think the world has to take a deep breath and understand that we are the front line of Pax Sinica. What's happening with us will happen with them. SARC has disappeared, so will the EU plus 27. The EU 27 will also disappear. The 17 plus 1 might be more influential at the end of 5 years. They might even have more members. So I think what you need to understand is that we are the experiment. We are the first stage of a Chinese juggernaut. The border is an excuse. The border is but a front. The border is but a test bed of China getting its way, getting its political terms, getting its geo-economic terms, and getting its writ large on the region that it believes it should dominate. The regional spread is going to grow. They are not interested in a $3 trillion Indian economy. Jonathan is absolutely right. They want to dominate the $20 trillion European market. So best of luck. As you watch our misery, protect yourself and have a conversation with us, because they want you. We are in the way. We are the front line that stands between you and Pax Sinica.
Wow, thank you so much, Dr. Saran. That was phenomenal. There are lots of questions and lots of questions pouring in. So what I'll do is I'll just ask two questions which have actually come from my colleagues in the politics faculty, both actually directed initially from Manish's presentation, but I would like everyone to respond to it. The first question is, how much is ideology playing into it, which is something that Dr. Saran too ended with a little bit, that, this is a kind of Chinese worldview that is being, is in expansion mode, and we all have to live with it. And the second question, which if you don't remember, I'll come back to it, and which is the question of distraction that Manish opened up, Mr. Tiwari opened up with, that if this is about distraction politics, deflection politics from COVID, then why is it that China is underplaying this border fracas in its own social media, and why is its government not talking about it in a way that all the talking about it, what has happened in Ladakh, has come from Indian strategic community and the press. So why don't I start with you, Mr. Tiwari, and then take it around.
I think, Dr. Kapila, before I answer that question, we can intellectualize the Chinese moves as much as we possibly would like to. But let's not forget the fact that the Chinese have humiliated India. Post 1975, there hasn't been an incident of this nature, of this gravity. And notwithstanding what Dr. Saran says with regard to the Depsang incident of 2013, or Chumar in 2014, when Prime Minister Modi and Xi Jinping were swinging on a swing in Ahmedabad, this is qualitatively different. India, as we speak, is seething. There is great anger, and I can tell you as someone who has a parliamentary constituency of 2 million people and contributes hugely to the Indian armed forces in terms of human resource, now going back almost 100 years or 200 years, even in terms of our contribution as a region to the British Indian Army and stuff like that. There is tremendous amount of anger. I don't think any intellectualization can really contextualize the humiliation.
No, if I may...
that India is experiencing, that India...
If I may
Shruti, the reason I'm saying that is that let's not try and in any manner undermine the seriousness of what the Chinese have done. And so therefore, insofar as a response is concerned, I think that's something which we will leave to the government. But I'm giving you a sense of what India is feeling currently. To answer your question straight off the bat, why are the Chinese playing it down? Well, the Chinese are playing Tweedledum and Tweedlee. So therefore, they've made their point, and they are trying to sort of demonstrate to international public opinion that they continue to be a responsible global power. Because if my thesis is correct, if my proposition is correct, that this is about wiping the COVID-19 headlines off the international media, then it all fits in, for the simple reason that the reason why China would want to do that is primarily because this kind of publicity or this kind of questioning, trying to hold China to account, is something which directly transgresses upon its own great power aspirations. So therefore, under those circumstances, while I agree with Dr. Saran that China may have a larger game plan in terms of Pax Seneca and stuff like that, but there is no immediate cause, or there was no immediate provocation for what has happened on the Sino-Indian border. It is not as if the Indians had transgressed into Chinese territory. It is not as if the border infrastructure that we have been trying to upgrade in our own land is something which started happening as of yesterday. In fact, the DBO road which goes up to Daulat Beg Uldi is almost complete and has been in the works now for the past 7 or 8 years. So therefore, you really need to find the inflection point or the trigger which set the Chinese off on the Indian soldiers with brutality, which, if you go by some of the accounts which have now emerged, is something which is completely horrendous and barbaric. So therefore, under those circumstances, I don't think China is playing it down. China has made its point and is just trying to sort of walk the tightrope of trying to pretend that it is a responsible power.
Okay, can I quickly?
Dr. Saran, of course, and if I may,
I think Manish got my point slightly wrong. I think he misconstrued what I was trying to say. I am not either blaming his government or the current one. I'm blaming all governments in terms of how we've misunderstood the Chinese play, and that's the point I'm trying to make. This is not. He's absolutely right. This incident is not of the making of yesterday. Their attempt to deflect headlines could be the immediate provocation, but that is not the reason why you would take on someone and head into a conflict which has the potential of tying you into something regional for a long time. I think in my own assessment, in my own work, I actually evaluated Doklam as that turning point. And unfortunately, I wrote in that book that this is the beginning of a time period where there will be multiple skirmishes, some of them very violent in the coming years, because Doklam was something that was not palatable to them. They were not used to someone going and standing up to them. And Aparna is absolutely right. Eventually, the Indians backed out, and they did retain control over the most important parts of that plateau. But the brand that they were trying to build as the sole arbiters of the region was damaged. The Chinese were upset with what had happened in Doklam. They wanted to correct what had happened in Doklam. This was a good moment because the Americans are lost, the Europeans are struggling, and they believed that this was a good time because everyone was so concerned with the COVID virus that this was a good time to settle some old scores. Now, we don't have to necessarily sit and try and play the shrink for the Chinese. I think what I hate the most is when we try to second guess why they did it. Let's be very clear. None of us know why the Chinese do many things in this world. I think we have to judge them by their actions. And their actions over the last, like he mentioned, 13, 14, 17, 19, over the last 5 years tell us that there is an increasing ability and motivation in China to alter the border with India. And I think that is apparent. Now, Manish tweeted about, I think I probably read a tweet by Manish where he says that why was the mountain strike code not completed? Why were certain things not done? I think those are very important questions to ask. Why were the intelligence reforms that were suggested in the post-Kargil not implemented? That we had dispatches available in February that the Chinese were moving and we were still caught off guard. The point is that I think what has happened is that even as China is seeking to control, and I disagree with Manish. I don't think China is going to change the headline and suddenly become a responsible power for the rest of the world. I think Xi Jinping is struggling to project himself as anyone responsible. But it has certainly moved the debate away from the Wuhan virus. I think that's the point Manish was trying to make. They have moved the debate away from the Wuhan virus to a Ladakh confrontation. It does not necessarily make them more responsible in the estimation of many global actors, but it also shows that India has not got its act together over the last decade or two. And I think that is the more significant takeaway if you are someone who, as Mr. Tiwari mentioned, is trying to put this in a larger framework. The larger framework is that we haven't learned that how to deal with China over the last 2 decades. We have had more recent incidents that should have accelerated the process of creating resilience and response. And clearly, as Jonathan mentioned, we should have quickly buried non-alignment and non-alignment 2.0 and got into the business of doing things that are important for us. You don't have to give labels to things. You should make partnerships and you should do trade and you should do deals and you should create investments that help your country create strength. And I think some of it is something that all political parties realize, but we are currently so consumed with our own domestic Twitter wars that we don't realize that we have a Himalayan war we need to respond to. We are so busy scoring brownie points in our own public sphere that we don't realize that we have a China on the gate, China on our gate, which is busy enjoying the loud noise in the room that is called India. And I think we need to wake up. I am not putting any theoretical framework. I'm just telling you what has happened over the last 20 years.
So may I make a quick point?
Of course.
Okay, thanks. I just wanted to say that, if we, to both the questions you asked us, why is China doing it now, or does ideology play a role, or does COVID? I'd just like to mention that if we go back actually to 1962, there are many who blame India for 1962, but if you actually read the Chinese records, Mao Zedong had a problem domestically, which was the Great Leap Forward had hurt his image. He needed to restore his image domestically. COVID has affected and impacted China's narrative, as Samir mentioned. China and Xi Jinping do not look as strong to the world. The world is blaming them. And so therefore, if you are at a crucial juncture in the CCP's history and you would like to make sure that China is the main power in Asia, then you need to demonstrate that you are the leading player and not India or another country or India plus US. And so therefore, starting sort of clamping down on Hong Kong, renaming islands sort of in South China Sea, sort of trying to start a conflict and trying to punish India on the Himalayan border is a very good way to demonstrate that you are still the top dog in Asia, and divert attention from COVID and demonstrate legitimacy and change the narrative away from COVID. Thanks.
No, that's great. Jonathan,
can I briefly step in?
You could, Jonathan, before you come in on this, there's actually a question that has come for you, which I will ask you to lead on and then take it to others, which is to say that has India learned anything at all from what has happened to it and her interests in the South China Seas for the Himalayan side? So why is there failure to learn from one geostrategic failure in its own neighborhood, i.e. the seas? And so that's really the question, has India learned? And this is from Casey Lin again, your colleague as well. So that's, if you could sort of relate it to that, and what are the possibilities of alliances and international law that can come in to offset Chinese actions, if any? So that's really the question, that where can we actually move out of this kind of juggernaut? Because all of you have painted a rather confining picture where there is this kind of really powerful behemoth, which is guzzling up India, guzzling up the world economy. Yet, as we also know, it is a power which has very few friends, if I can put it like that. It doesn't have that many allies and natural friendships like, say, the Americans did or do. So the question really arises, is that why is it that the international order is so, and as well as India, so dumbfounded by this play of aggression?
Thank you, KC, also for that very pertinent question. I think when it comes to India learning from what happened in the South China Sea and the other adjacent seas, I think India actually has closely watched what happened over there, has closely monitored the land reclamation and the buildup of a very formidable anti-access and area denial capacity. I think the core problem for India at this moment is that it just lacks the capacity and the financial wherewithal to respond. I think that goes for its naval capabilities, but that also goes for its capacity to respond to China's growing presence on the Tibetan plateau and along the border. We already referred to the Mountain Strike Corps. We can also refer to the border roads, many other examples. I think the core problem for India, and I think most of us will agree on that, is economic fragility, is also a certain degree of political confusion, and a lack of hard power when it comes to China's rise. And that leads me to a second important observation. Of course, I can feel what Aparna just said about China seeking to divert some of the domestic let's say misgivings and frustrations by opening this new incident. But instead of continuing at this point, given the fact that the evidence and the sources are so few, it's better just to look at the changes in terms of the balance of power. I think what we are witnessing is a country that is on a typical imperial trajectory, that has done a great job in industrialization, that now has emerged as a very potent trading nation, and that slowly but surely hardens its influence, as Paul Kennedy put it, which means that it is fortifying its borders on the continent, but also offshore, and that it's also seeking to protect militarily and diplomatically its influence overseas. So I think we can be quite clear, I think, about what to expect from China today and in the future. If it stays on that trajectory, and if India, but also other Eurasian powers fall behind, we will see more assertiveness, and we will see more countries struggle with that. Now, there was one comment made by Samir about the European Union, and I just want to clarify what my point was all about. I was not intended to criticize India for certain foreign policy choices. All I was willing to say is that I think what gives a particular advantage to China is that its extended neighborhood. I think the area that Spikeman referred to as the rimland, the maritime margins of Eurasia, are increasingly weakened or increasingly divided. And for me, that rimland starts off in Europe, and as Samir, I think, rightly said, Europe at this moment is a complete mess. Also, when it comes to China, I think in terms of trade, investment, screening, and so forth, we are just pretending that we respond more forcefully, but in fact, we are unleashing the one paper tiger after the other. Then we have the Middle East. Then we journey into Southern Asia, which I think also has a lot of difficulties. Then we move into a divided Southeast Asia, which of course gives China a lot of opportunities to play on divisions and on weakness. And it was mentioned that China doesn't have a lot of partners and friends. I would actually take issue with that. What China needs at this moment is not even a lot of friends. It's enough for China that many countries in the Eurasian rimland continue to hedge, continue to refuse to choose a certain camp, and continue to try to play it both ways, to do a little bit of business with China and a little bit of security with the United States, for China to continue to grow its trade and economic influences, and hence also to shore up its military capabilities. So I think at this stage, China doesn't really need a lot of friends. It just needs enough countries that allow it to do what it has been doing over the last few years. And even if it comes to friends, I think we should not underestimate how many partners that China already has today that prefer economic and security ties with China above those with other countries. In conclusion, I think that what we must be looking at from both an Indian perspective, American perspective, and European perspective is to come to grips with our own weakness in terms of resolve, in terms of how we have handled, I would say, highly imbalanced trade relations that permit China still today to grow its economic influence and its military might. I think that's the core issue. Last year, Europe had a trade deficit with China of 195 billion euros, which is sterilized by the Chinese central bank still into kind of all credit lines that it uses to grow its influence everywhere in the Indian Ocean and beyond. For India too, like we have had many discussions in the Lok Sabha and the Indian government about having a serious response to Chinese dumping policies. But all we see is that last year the Indian government has signed up on an AIIB loan, a BRIC bank loan, which is in essence, I think, an instrument used by China to appease, so to say, economically India, and to make sure that it doesn't, let's say, seriously confront China on this persistent and balanced trade relationship. So I think as long as we continue to give China the means financially, economically, and commercially to grow more powerful, which is also a situation that complicates it for countries like India to start to grow. We will see a continuation of the power shift and hence more assertiveness on all kind of different places.
Right. Thank you, Jonathan. I'm delighted to say that Gideon Rachman of the Financial Times is with us, and he's asked a question particularly of the Indian panelists. And his question is, what options does the Modi government have right now? And how does this affect his domestic standing? So Manish, could you sort of start, and then perhaps Samir and Aparna can follow. What are the options, realistic options? So the focus not now on China, but moving on to India and the Modi government itself.
I think the Observer Research Foundation works fairly closely with the government. And so therefore, Samir perhaps would be in a better position to answer that question than me. So I'll defer to him.
Right, okay. So on to you, Saran.
No, actually, we host a conference with the government. We don't stage war games or conflict preparation. And
what are the realistic options available? I mean, I think it's
conferences with his government as well. Yes. Unfortunately, they couldn't hold on to the government. Otherwise, we would have been hosting conferences even today. But having said that, I think the options for any country which is seeing erosion of its territory has to be to protect that, to stop that. Now, I think Jonathan raised a very important point. And I think Aparna and Mr. Tiwari also mentioned it in an oblique sense. I think the Chinese, when they were a much smaller actor in the South China Sea and trying to find space for themselves in the Western Pacific with much smaller resources available to them, they were able to create a area denial capability to keep the Americans at bay, and to increase the cost for Americans to interfere with their political space. I think India will have to find a very similar approach. We will have to find an approach of a smaller power that will have to use asymmetric tactics to increase the cost of encroachment. The Chinese did that in the seas 15 years ago. We'll have to find a mountain model of the same. So that's something we can learn from the sea. We can probably take a leaf out of the Chinese playbook to do it. But I think most importantly, the Indian resolution has to be political. I think Indians need to decide that who really our enemy is. is the enemy the blue tick guy from the opposition party and the ruling party? Are we going to fight amongst ourselves, or are we going to really achieve a national approach to deal with something that is going to be persisting for at least a decade, if not more, until we become a $6-7 trillion economy? I think the asymmetry is going to remain. Till such time, for the next decade, we are going to have them nipping at our heels. And we will have to create a national consensus. And no, ORF is not the place for that. I think the Congress party and the BJP will have to find a way of talking to each other. So I think on the 19th, when the all-party meeting has been called, I hope there is a serious conversation. I hope there is a sensible conversation. And I hope in a tradition of good democracies, there is a political consensus and a political convergence that yes, even as we disagree on everything else, we can agree on the fact that territory is important, sovereignty is important, and it is in our common interest to protect it.
Well, thank you. This is followed up. Yeah, can I just tack on, because lots of questions are coming. I'm just quickly tack on another point which is related to it, which is to say that how curtailed is India? This is from Neha Devan. I think she works in Shashi Tharoor's office, and her question is how much is the defeat of the 1962 weighing on, as it were, Indian psyche and policy mindset? I mean, is that really an obstacle, or have people moved on from it? And is that something that is something that we haven't come over, despite all the talk? And this is related to the party political point, because of course Nehru and 1962 are opposed as well. So Manish first, and then Aparna to you. Yeah.
Well, 1962 happened 58 years back. And I think there is also a need to put things in a perspective. If there was a 1962, there was a 1967 in Nathula also, where the Indians gave the Chinese a bloody nose. 300 Chinese soldiers were killed, and we lost 80 Indian lives. And the Chinese never looked the Indian way for the next 20 years. We gave them a bloody nose again in Samundrajung Chu in 1987, when General Sundarji was the chief of the army staff, and Mr. Gandhi was the Prime Minister of India. In fact, Samundrajung Chu paved the way for the 1988 visit of Mr. Gandhi to China, which was the first visit of an Indian Prime Minister after 22 years, and the subsequent conversations with Deng Xiaoping, which in 1993 led to the Tranquility Agreement, and then it was sort of improvised upon by successive administrations. So therefore, I don't think that there should be any illusion that the Indian policy establishment or the military establishment is laboring under some kind of a 1962 hangover. Even in 1962, everything was not lost. There was the Battle of Raisingla, where the Chinese had to fight the Indians to the last man. So it's not as if, I mean, that's not to deflect from the point that in 1962, we were surprised. And yes, we had a setback. To put it very bluntly, India was at the receiving end. But I think we've moved from there. The Indian Army of 1962 or the Indian Armed Forces are not the armed forces of 2020. Yes, there are modernization issues, which Arpana pointed out too. There are defense budget issues. Nobody is trying to really run away from that. There are questions with regard to why was the Mountain Strike Corps abandoned midway, but those are questions which will be asked in Parliament and in the relevant and appropriate forums as we as we discuss this. But I think the broader point is that India somehow does not have an agreed China policy, like we do not have an agreed Pakistan policy, or for that matter, we do not have an agreed Nepal policy, or for that matter, in fact, surprisingly, India has a broad agreement when it comes to its relationship with the United States of America. In fact, we do not even have an agreed EU policy. The FTA with the EU has now been pending since 2008 across successive administrations. So I think there is a need for greater synergy between the strategic establishment and our foreign office, and to first, get some policy templates in place, and then try and build the wider political consensus around it. But if you start using your neighbors as a proxy in order to score political brownie points domestically, then I'm afraid you run a gauntlet where the ability to be able to design and to be able to then persevere with that consensus becomes severely undermined.
Aparna, do you want to, thank you.
Quick 3 points. One, the earlier question asked about what India can do immediately or what India can learn from South China Sea. So, I mean, by and large, India and Indian government has focused traditionally on how to combat China on the Himalayan border. India has more advantages in sea. India has more advantages in the Indian Ocean region. Sort of the way to counter China is, yes, we need to build our capabilities on the mountain border, but we also need to push back at China where we have an advantage and China does not. So the Indian Ocean region, India's alliances in the South China Sea can push back against China. India can build up its capability much more over there than it can do immediately on the Himalayan border. Second, there's the economic dimension. Where sort of, the sort of India will have to, over a period of time, find ways that it can sort of, it may not be able to change the trade deficit, but there are certain areas where it can start pushing back against Chinese companies, Chinese technology. Samir had mentioned that the digital age is important. And so it's important where India gets the technology and whom India sides with in this technology warfare. And final, the political consensus is important. Both Manish and Samir mentioned that. But it's also important that we focus on building up India's economy. And Jonathan mentioned that unless India grows at 8%, India will not be able to do anything on the economic, military front, and India will not be able to combat China on any of these fronts. Economic growth is paramount. Thank you.
Thank you. So now just a final question on a geostrategic question before I take concluding comments. One is on a very good question asked by Robert Moore. We have a large number of outstanding questions coming in, but I'm not going to be able to actually field all of them. And that is a fantastic question, that why has China focused on India as opposed to Japan, given that its historic enmity has been with Japan? So why has Japan got off lightly in this new age of expansionism in the Chinese empire? So Jonathan, as a kind of expert on Asian politics, would you want to start? But may I just ask you to be a bit more brisk so that we can get all others in? Thank you.
Well, I just don't think that Japan has been treated, let's say, more politely by China in the East China Sea and in other places. In fact, as we speak, the Japanese archipelago is being enveloped by the PLA Navy and so forth. So I don't think that China has kind of refrained from flexing its muscle towards Japan. I think just the Japanese government still is showing a lot of lenience, so to say, towards China's power grab in the East China Sea, and that a lot of big Japanese industrial conglomerates, in spite of this threat of pulling back from China, are still hesitant about what to do. So I wouldn't really agree that there is, let's say, a significant difference in terms of Chinese attitude towards Tokyo.
Right. Aparna, would you want to come in?
Yeah, I just wanted to make something to tag on to what Jonathan said. I don't believe that, I think China is sort of push against all its neighbors. And one of its policies is it doesn't directly push against a strategic neighbor as much as use its neighbors. So it's using North Korea or South Korea against Japan or Russia against Japan, achieves China's purpose. It doesn't have to directly push back against Japan. Just as with South Asia, if sort of India has problems with Nepal and Pakistan and Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, and India is sort of has to deal with all of these neighbors, it's the same. It's like using another deterrent against your main rival. The second point I'd say is that, for the last few years, the Indo-Pacific strategy of the United States and many other countries around the world is to try and sort of ask India to step up and play a bigger role. And to some extent, that is resented by China. So sort of, trying to push back against China, this is something I think Samir mentioned in the beginning, is also its way of saying that, Asia is for China only. There should not be another power which tries to rise up either on its own or sort of helped or supported by external countries. So sort of in a way, push back and let India know that you are never going to be a competitor to us. Thank you.
Right.
So, Shruti, may I come in for a second? I think there's another dimension to it, and the dimension is the security relationship between the United States and Japan. So therefore, China knows that if you are going to take on Japan a little more than what you've done in the Senkaku Islands, etc., it is going to come at a cost. China has not been able to take on even Taiwan because of the security relationship between the US and Taiwan. So therefore, India, in those terms, primarily because of the historical stances which we have taken, whose veracity in hindsight, we can discuss at some other point in time. But the fact remains that India does not have those military alliances or security relationships. I think there are trigger clauses in the US-Japan security agreements. American troops are forward positioned in Japan, very close to China. And I think that acts as a fairly big deterrent here.
Right. So, Samir, do you want to say anything, Dr. Saran, to this?
I tend to agree with both Mr. Tiwari and Jonathan. I think, the Chinese are nipping away at the Japanese, and it's happening even as we speak. For the last few days, weeks, they've been doing this, and the Japanese are certainly more courteous than the Indian Twitterati or the Indian public sphere. So we don't hear as much about it. But China has created a serious front there. And I agree with Mr. Tiwari that China is going to be extremely cautious because the costs of messing with Japan are higher. And I think, like one of my colleagues mentioned in today's conversations, I don't remember in which of the mediums, there are so many of them. But as someone mentioned, I think India will have to create more unpredictability in its response to China. I think China believes that somehow it has gamed us. It understands how our lethargic, predictable, boring, bureaucratic system, and of course the loud political ecosystem is going to impede or allow any Indian response. I think we have to become far more unpredictable in dealing with China. I think the Japanese relationship is protected by the unpredictable American, which whether you like it or not, the Chinese are not able to fathom, and none of us can actually. But the Chinese also do not understand Mr. Trump.
Oh yes, thank you very much. And for final question and final thoughts, looking ahead, because I'm a historian, I can't sort of look ahead so carefully, but looking ahead in the post-COVID world geography, do you think the global decoupling of the economy from China is actually going to take place, which is part of perhaps the motivations which we started with that Manish Tiwari mentioned, to distract, but also there is obviously some murmurs in the world economy to kind of decouple its dependence from China. Is India likely to benefit from that decoupling? Is that decoupling likely to happen? So what does the post-COVID Asia and the global economy look like? So I'll start with Jonathan and I'll reverse the order here. So Jonathan, why don't you start, followed by Aparna?
Thank you. I'm skeptical with regard to the idea of decoupling. First of all, if we look back at the last 3 years of trade war, quote unquote, between China and the United States, we have seen that this hardly led towards a greater interest of foreign companies to invest, for example, in India or in ASEAN. China kept attracting way much more foreign direct investment, also much more portfolio investment and so forth. If we consider the investment intentions of major European, Japanese and Singaporean companies, also over the last few months, we have no indication that they consider pulling back from India. At best, they will diversify. And even if they want to diversify, it's not certain that India would benefit a lot from that. There are still alternative markets in Southeast Asia and so forth. So I would say that supply chains have become very, very much oriented towards China, and has happened in the past. I think they will only slowly move towards other places. China, of course, is also very, very actively seeking to cultivate new expectations among European, Japanese companies, and so forth. It's somewhat taking for granted that there will be a setback on the American front. But as I said, there are still a lot of major economies hedging their bets, also very large companies hedging their bets. And at this point, clearly refusing to shift away from China, and also keep stating that the alternatives are complicated. To consider India, there is a lot of disgruntlement among big foreign companies, international companies still. So I think we will see a slow reorientation of production chains, but certainly no dramatic alteration.
Right, great. Aparna Pandey.
So I'd like to sort of, I agree with Jonathan to the extent that decoupling is going to be very difficult. China has been smart about it. It has actually become part of every global chain. It's one of the largest, one of the top trading partners for every country. So companies will move only when they have an incentive. In the case of Japan, the Japanese government is actually planning on sort of, paying companies to move out of China. If that happens, then companies may be sort of amenable to do it. But if they do, most of them, according to recent reports, may actually go to either Taiwan, South Korea, Vietnam, Thailand. They are not necessarily going to come to India, because India hasn't really even though India is a logical market, it's large labor force, cheap labor force, but we need the economic reforms. We need to go higher up on the ease of business rankings in order for them to do so. So it needs an incentive by their government and work on India's end. So it will take time. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon.
Right. Mr. Tiwari.
Well, I think this question is something which essentially would depend upon how does the world fashion its post-COVID economic response. You see, if you really look at things from 2013 or 2014 in a perspective, globalization or the forces of globalism have been challenged by the rise of right-wing populists, ultra-nationalistic rhetoric, tariffs in various countries going up, especially the United States, leading that charge from the front. But the fact is that when the global economy is going to be in a problematic situation, would these responses that we've seen play themselves out in the past 5 or 6 years get actually more magnified? Or would there be a pushback in order to restore the global supply chains and fall back on what has been the established order in order to help the global economy come out of the present crisis? So I think to a very large extent, our response our economic response post-COVID is really going to be able to answer this question, that can China become the outlier, or will China remain at the middle of the global manufacturing order for the next 1 decade? The second is that if a conscious decision is being taken, if a conscious decision is taken by democracies around the world, and which means rising above their own economic imperatives and being prepared to take a hit, that this kind of Chinese hegemony is something which cannot be allowed to go unchecked, then possibly you're looking at a new paradigm. Because even as we speak, China remains the largest supplier of even medical equipment. In terms of, if you look at the COVID response, the testing kits, the PPE suits, the gloves, and most countries around the world have had this bitter experience of Chinese companies actually shipping at a point in time when the need was critical, absolutely substandard testing equipment, which ultimately had to be jumped. India, in its initial response to the COVID situation in March and April, had to go through this. I think various other countries may have also had to go through the same situation. So I guess the whether China remains at the center of the global supply chains would really depend upon how you resuscitate the institutions of global governance. Because the one thing which COVID-19 has demonstrated is that the institutions of global governance have completely and absolutely failed us at a point in time when they were needed the most.
Thank you very much. Dr. Saran?
No, I tend to agree with Mr. Tiwari, like I always do, on the possibility of a dramatic possibility of a dramatic shift in the format of globalization post COVID. I think, of course, the incumbency will continue to challenge many mindsets to create dramatic change. But I think the pandemic may be that disruptive moment when what emerges on the other side may really look different. And I do not, and I'm going to say two contradictory, I'm going to make two contradictory predictions. First, I think the Chinese will continue to gain strength on the other side of this crisis. They would have already built a constituency of believers who they would have nourished and protected during this crisis, and they are going to remain with them. I think much of the African continent, a large part of Eurasia, many of the rimland countries that Jonathan listed, many of the Southern European countries and Central European countries are going to be part of China's continued growth, the rise and rise of China, and I don't think that is going to stop. However, there is going to be also a possibility of new winners emerging on the other side. Vietnam could be one of them. India certainly is going to be an important country. But some other new actors who are going to see large focus by countries who do not trust China are going to emerge out of the pandemic as well. And I can tell you that there was this recent decision in the newspapers more recently about Apple coming in with a big chunk of its export unit to India. It is actually shipping plants. It's not putting new machinery, it's bringing plants into India. It wants to export $36 billion worth of phones in the next 2 years, which is, it currently does $180 billion a year out of China. So what I'm saying is there is already a tendency of companies de-risking themselves from single geographies. They are not going to say no to China, as Jonathan is right. They're not going to move out and completely vacate the Chinese space as their base, but they are going to create other bases as well. I think diversification and decentralization is going to be a very important management decision post this pandemic. This pandemic tells us that decentralized systems do better. And therefore, you will see decentralized globalization emerge. I have called it gated globalization in one of my papers. You're going to see political trust becoming the currency that is going to create clusters around which economic activity will take place. There will certainly be a Chinese cluster. There will certainly be a cluster which will be a little bit careful in dealing with China. So I think you're going to see both emerge outside this pandemic. And I think it kind of relates to the 2 points Mr. Tiwari was making.
Right. Thank you very much and for all your comments and a stellar panel. We could go on, but time is moving on. So my thanks to Dr. Aparna Pandey, Professor Jonathan Horslag, Dr. Samir Saran, and Dr. Manish Tiwari. And this will be available on our website. And I thank you on behalf of the Center for Geopolitics at the University of Cambridge for such a stellar, insightful discussion. Thank you very much.